I never imagined my world could change so drastically in just one night. It started as a motherly gesture, offering comfort to my son after a long day. But as the night deepened, an unexpected tension filled the air. His gaze lingered, his touch softened, and the line between us blurred in ways I never thought possible. I couldn't move, couldn't think, only feel the weight of the moment. My name is Emily, and I'm a 44-year-old single mother. Life has thrown its share of challenges my way, but raising my son, Ethan, has been the one constant, the one joy I could always count on. It's been just the two of us for so long, navigating life's highs and lows, forming a bond stronger than I could have ever imagined. Ethan, now 22, has always been my pride and joy. A hardworking young man with a sharp mind and a heart full of kindness, he's everything I could have hoped for in a son. From late-night study sessions to quiet evenings watching old movies, our lives have revolved around each other. Our small, cozy home became our sanctuary, filled with laughter, shared meals, and endless conversations. But being a single parent hasn't been easy. There were nights when loneliness would creep in, when the silence of an empty bed felt deafening. Still, I found solace in the knowledge that I was raising someone remarkable. Ethan was my world, my purpose, my anchor in the storm of life. On the night that changed everything, Ethan had returned home exhausted. His college workload had been intense lately, and the stress was beginning to show. Dark circles rimmed his eyes, and his usually bright smile was replaced by a weary expression. As he slumped onto the couch, I couldn't help but feel a pang of concern. "Why don't you lie down in my room?" I suggested, knowing my bed would be warmer and more comfortable. It wasn't unusual for us to share spaces in the house. Ethan had always been affectionate and close, even as he grew older. I tucked a heavy blanket over him, brushing his hair back like I used to when he was a little boy. He gave me a tired smile before closing his eyes. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I watched him drift off, a wave of nostalgia washing over me. But as the minutes ticked by, the air in the room seemed to shift. His body unconsciously moved closer, his arm brushing against mine. It was so subtle at first that I didn't think much of it. Yet, an unfamiliar tension began to stir. A sensation I couldn't quite name but couldn't ignore either. At first, I told myself it was nothing. A mother offering her son comfort after a long, exhausting day. Ethan's arm brushed against mine as he curled deeper into the blanket, seeking warmth. It was so innocent, so natural, or at least that's what I kept repeating in my head. But as the moments stretched on, the room felt different. The silence wasn't the familiar, comfortable kind we usually shared. It was heavier, charged with something unspoken. I sat there, frozen in place, my mind caught between rationalizing the moment and grappling with an unease I couldn't ignore. Ethan shifted again, his arm now resting lightly over mine. The touch wasn't deliberate. Or was it? My heartbeat quickened, and I found myself staring at the faint rise and fall of his chest as he slept. I wanted to stand, to walk away and shake off the strange energy in the room, but something kept me rooted there. The quiet felt deafening, like it was pressing down on me, forcing me to confront emotions I couldn't understand. I kept telling myself that I was overthinking it, that exhaustion and loneliness were playing tricks on my mind. Ethan stirred again, his head turning slightly toward me. His eyes opened for a brief moment, meeting mine. There was something in his gaze, a softness, a question perhaps? I couldn't decipher it, but it sent a shiver down my spine. I smiled faintly, hoping it would ease whatever tension was building, but his gaze lingered, steady and unwavering. As he closed his eyes again, I exhaled, trying to regain control of my thoughts. Yet, his proximity felt like a magnet, pulling me in ways I couldn't explain. My mind raced with excuses. He was tired. He needed comfort. and this was nothing more than a tender moment between mother and son. But then, why did it feel so different? Why couldn't I just get up and leave? The air grew colder, or maybe it was just my imagination. I wrapped my arms around myself, pretending it was to ward off the chill, but the truth was far more complicated. Ethan shifted again, his hand brushing against mine. It was so subtle, so innocent, but it sent a jolt through me like a current I couldn't ignore. The thoughts that crept into my mind frightened me. Was it loneliness? Was it the years of isolation, of carrying the weight of everything on my own? Or was it something deeper, something darker, lying dormant all this time? I couldn't tell anymore. All I knew was that the tension in the room was growing, wrapping around me like an invisible force. Ethan's breathing was steady, his presence so close it was almost overwhelming. I found myself hyper-aware of every small movement, every gentle brush of his hand or shift of his body. The logical part of me screamed to end the moment, to walk out of the room and let the stillness return. But another part of me, one I didn't fully understand, held me in place. As the minutes ticked by, the line between mother and son seemed to blur in my mind. The room felt smaller, the space between us shrinking with every passing second. I wanted to believe it was all in my head, that nothing had changed between us. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something had shifted, something that couldn't be undone. Ethan moved again, his hand brushing against my arm as if seeking reassurance. His touch was soft, hesitant, but it left a trail of warmth in its wake. My heart raced, and I forced myself to take a deep breath, willing the moment to pass. But even as I sat there, trying to push the thoughts away, I couldn't help but feel that this was just the beginning of something I wasn't prepared to face. I told myself I was overthinking it. Ethan was simply seeking comfort, something that wasn't unusual for us. But the way his hand rested lightly on mine, the subtle pressure of his touch, felt anything but ordinary. It wasn't just the gesture. It was the way it lingered, the way it sent a warmth spreading through me that I couldn't ignore. I shifted slightly, trying to create distance, but Ethan followed the movement unconsciously, his hand now brushing my arm. My breathing hitched, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts I didn't dare put into words. I wanted to break the moment, to say something lighthearted and diffuse the tension, but my voice refused to cooperate. I stayed silent, frozen in place, as the warmth of his hand sent shivers down my spine. Ethan's head tilted slightly, and he looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. His eyes held a softness that felt out of place, almost too intense for the moment. "Are you okay, Mom?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. I nodded quickly, forcing a smile. "Of course, sweetheart. You just looked so tired. I wanted to make sure you were comfortable." He smiled faintly, but the moment didn't break. If anything, his gaze grew more focused, more searching. I felt a flush creep up my neck, and I looked away, hoping it would ease the strange tension that had settled between us. But it didn't. Ethan shifted closer, his arm brushing against mine again. The contact felt electric, sending a rush of conflicting emotions through me. I told myself to pull away, to end the moment, but instead, I stayed. My heart pounded in my chest, and I couldn't bring myself to move. "Mom," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've always been there for me, you know that? No one's ever made me feel as safe as you do." His words sent a pang through my chest, and I felt my throat tighten. "That's my job," I replied, my voice shaky. "You're my son. Of course I'll always be here for you." He smiled again, but this time it was different. Softer, more intimate. I didn't know how to process it, and the air between us felt heavier with each passing second. The rational part of my brain screamed at me to leave the room, to put distance between us, but my body wouldn't listen. Ethan's hand moved then, so lightly I almost didn't notice at first. His fingers brushed against mine, tracing the edge of my palm. The touch was hesitant, almost testing, as if he was waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. I stayed, my breath shallow, my thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and something I didn't want to name. The room seemed to shrink around us, the silence pressing in. His hand moved again, this time resting against mine fully. I looked up, meeting his gaze, and the intensity in his eyes made my stomach flip. There was something there, something unspoken but impossible to ignore. I opened my mouth to say something, anything to break the moment, but no words came out. Ethan leaned closer, his face just inches from mine. My pulse raced, and I felt a heat rise in my cheeks. I knew I should move, should stop whatever was happening, but I was frozen in place. "Mom," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I don't know how to explain this, but I feel like there's something here. Something I can't ignore." I swallowed hard, my mind spinning. "Ethan," I began, my voice barely audible. This is complicated." He nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving mine. "I know, but I can't stop thinking about it. About you." The weight of his words hit me like a tidal wave. I felt a strange mix of emotions: shock, confusion, fear, and something else. Something deeper that I didn't want to admit. I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat. Ethan's hand moved again, brushing against my cheek this time. The gesture was so soft, so tender, that it left me breathless. His touch lingered, and I felt myself leaning into it without thinking. My heart pounded so loudly in my chest that I was sure he could hear it. "We can't," I whispered, finally finding my voice. "Ethan, it's not right." "I know," he said, his voice full of emotion. "But it feels... I don't know. It feels like it's always been there. Like I've just been too scared to see it." Tears pricked the corners of my eyes, and I looked away, breaking the moment. "This isn't something we can just act on. You know that, don't you?" He nodded, but his expression didn't change. "I just needed to say it. I needed you to know." The air between us was thick with tension, and I felt like I was drowning in it. I knew we couldn't stay like this, caught in a moment that felt both impossible and inevitable. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to step back, physically and emotionally. "Ethan," I said softly, "we need to take a step back. We can't let this confusion take over." He nodded again, his eyes filled with a vulnerability that broke my heart. "I understand," he said, his voice barely audible. "But it doesn't make it any easier." As he stepped away, the weight of the moment stayed with me, lingering like a shadow I couldn't shake. The tension in the house was unbearable. Every glance, every word exchanged between Ethan and me seemed to carry the weight of everything unsaid. I tried to go about my day as if nothing had changed, but the truth was, everything had. The moment we shared the night before was imprinted in my mind, playing on a loop that I couldn't shut off. Ethan seemed quieter than usual, his movements careful, almost hesitant. I told myself it was for the best, that the distance we were creating was necessary. But deep down, I felt the ache of it, the loss of the closeness we'd always shared. That evening, as I was folding laundry in the living room, Ethan walked in. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching me, and I felt my stomach tighten. "Mom," he said softly, his voice almost trembling. "Can we talk?" I nodded, trying to steady myself. "Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind?" He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "About last night," he began, trailing off as if the words were too heavy to say aloud. I put the laundry down and gestured for him to sit beside me. He did, the couch dipping slightly under his weight. The air between us was thick, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. "What happened last night?" I started, my voice shaking slightly. Was a moment of confusion. We were both tired, and I think we need to leave it behind us. Ethan looked up at me then, his eyes filled with a mixture of emotions: pain, confusion, and something else I couldn't name. "But what if it wasn't just confusion?" he asked, his voice raw. "What if it was something real?" The room seemed to spin, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. "Ethan," I said firmly, "you're my son. What you're feeling, it's not what you think. It's just the closeness we've always had, nothing more." He shook his head, frustration flashing in his eyes. "Then why can't I stop thinking about it? Why does it feel like there's something between us that's bigger than just being mother and son?" I stared at him, my mind racing. How had we gotten here? How had the bond we shared become so tangled, so complicated? I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, a knock at the door broke the moment. I jumped, the sound pulling me back to reality. "I'll get it," I said quickly, needing the distraction. I stood and walked to the door, my hands trembling as I reached for the handle. When I opened it, Logan, our neighbor, stood on the porch. He gave me his usual warm smile, but there was a flicker of concern in his eyes. "Hey, Grace," he said. "I was just checking to see if everything's okay. You seemed off the other day." I forced a smile, trying to keep my voice steady. "Oh, we're fine, Logan. Just a little tired, that's all." He nodded, but his gaze lingered, searching my face. "If you need anything, you know I'm just next door." "Thank you," I said, stepping back to close the door. "I appreciate it." As I turned, I saw Ethan standing in the hallway, watching us. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes. Something dark, almost possessive. I felt a chill run through me as he walked back into the living room without a word. I followed him, my heart racing. "Ethan," I began, "you're not upset about Logan stopping by, are you?" He looked at me, his jaw clenched. "No," he said, but the tension in his voice told a different story. I sat down across from him, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on me. "Ethan," I said softly, "we need to figure this out. Whatever you're feeling, we can't let it define us. We can't let it ruin what we have." He looked away, his hands gripping the edge of the couch. "I know," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "But it's not that simple." For a moment, we sat in silence, the air between us heavy with everything we couldn't say. Then, as if drawn by some invisible force, Ethan reached out and took my hand. His touch was gentle, hesitant, and it sent a jolt through me that I couldn't ignore. "Ethan, please," I whispered, pulling my hand away. "We can't do this." He looked at me then, his eyes filled with tears. "I don't know how to stop," he said, his voice breaking. "I don't know how to go back to how things were." The raw emotion in his voice cut through me, and I felt tears welling up in my own eyes. "We'll figure it out," I said, my voice trembling. "We have to." The conversation hung in the air, unresolved and heavy. That night, I lay awake in my bed, the echoes of our words replaying in my mind. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, unsure whether to step back or let myself fall. In the days that followed, I tried to put distance between us. I focused on work, on chores, on anything that could distract me from the growing tension in the house. But no matter how hard I tried, the memory of that night lingered, a constant presence I couldn't escape. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, Ethan walked into the kitchen. He stood there for a moment, watching me, and I felt the familiar flutter of anxiety in my chest. "Mom," he said softly, "I need to say something." I turned to him, bracing myself. "What is it, Ethan?" He hesitated, his hands fidgeting nervously. "I've been thinking, maybe we should talk to someone, a therapist or someone who can help us figure this out." His suggestion caught me off guard, and I felt a rush of relief mixed with apprehension. "That's a good idea," I said carefully. "It might help us understand what's happening." He nodded, and for the first time in weeks, I saw a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "I just want things to go back to normal," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "I don't want to lose you." "You won't," I promised, my own voice shaking. "We'll get through this. Together." For the first time in what felt like forever, I believed my own words. Maybe we could find a way to untangle the mess we'd found ourselves in. Maybe there was a path back to the bond we'd always shared. A bond that didn't carry the weight of forbidden feelings. As we stood there, the silence between us felt different. It wasn't heavy or oppressive. It was hopeful, like the calm after a storm. The days following our decision to seek help felt like walking on eggshells. The tension that had once been unbearable now simmered beneath the surface, quieter but still present, waiting to resurface at the slightest provocation. I tried to focus on the small victories, the shared smiles, the way Ethan and I were slowly finding ways to talk again without the heavy weight of unspoken emotions. But every step forward seemed fragile, like it could shatter at any moment. Our first therapy session was awkward, to say the least. Sitting across from the therapist, a kind woman named Dr. Harper, I found myself struggling to articulate the tangled mess of emotions that had consumed our lives. Ethan seemed equally hesitant, his hands fidgeting in his lap as he avoided eye contact. "So," Dr. Harper began gently, "tell me about what's been going on. You mentioned feeling a strain in your relationship. Can you elaborate?" I glanced at Ethan, silently willing him to start, but he remained silent. Taking a deep breath, I decided to break the ice. "It's complicated," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "Ethan and I have always been close, but lately, it feels like that closeness has crossed into something it shouldn't." Dr. Harper nodded, her expression calm and non-judgmental. "When you say something it shouldn't, what do you mean?" I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. "There's been a shift in our dynamic, a tension that's hard to explain. It's like the lines between us have blurred." Ethan finally spoke then, his voice low and shaky. "I've been feeling things I know I shouldn't. It's confusing, and I don't know how to stop." His words hung in the air, raw and vulnerable. Dr. Harper nodded again, her gaze moving between the two of us. "It's important that we create a safe space here to unpack those feelings. What you're describing is complicated, yes, but it's also something we can work through together." The session continued, with Dr. Harper guiding us through a series of exercises to help us communicate more openly. She explained that feelings like these, though uncomfortable and taboo, could stem from deep emotional dependencies and blurred boundaries, especially in situations where one parent has shouldered the burden of raising a child alone. "It's not uncommon," she said, "for these kinds of feelings to arise in close-knit relationships. The key is to address them head-on and establish clear boundaries moving forward." Hearing her words was both a relief and a challenge. It helped to know we weren't alone, that there was an explanation for what we were going through. But the idea of confronting those feelings and rebuilding our relationship felt like an uphill battle. Over the next few weeks, we continued therapy, each session peeling back another layer of the emotions that had built up over the years. I learned that my own loneliness and isolation had played a significant role in the confusion I felt that night. Ethan, too, began to understand how his feelings were rooted in a deep need for connection and security, needs that had become entangled with the bond we shared as mother and son. But progress wasn't linear. There were moments when the weight of it all felt overwhelming. One evening, after a particularly difficult session, Ethan stormed out of the house, his frustrations spilling over. I wanted to chase after him, to fix things the way I always had, but Dr. Harper's words echoed in my mind. You can't always be the one to fix everything, Grace. Sometimes, you have to let him process things on his own. I waited, the hours stretching on like an eternity, until I heard the door creak open. Ethan walked in, his shoulders slumped, and his face etched with exhaustion. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice barely audible. I stood, my heart aching as I looked at him. "You don't have to apologize," I said. "This is hard for both of us, but we'll get through it. Together." He nodded, his expression softening, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. We sat down and talked late into the night, finally addressing some of the things we'd been too afraid to say. It wasn't easy, but it was a step in the right direction. As time went on, the moments of tension between us became less frequent. We learned to set boundaries, to redefine our relationship in a way that was healthy and supportive. Therapy helped us rebuild the foundation of trust and closeness we had always shared, but in a way that was free from the confusion and emotional entanglement that had threatened to destroy it. There were still scars, of course. Moments when a look or a gesture would remind me of that night, when the ache of what we'd been through would resurface. But those moments became easier to navigate as we grew stronger, as we learned to lean on each other without crossing the lines that had once been so blurred. In the end, the experience brought us closer, not in the way we'd feared, but in a way that was healthy and grounded. We learned that love, even when it becomes complicated, can be reshaped and redefined. And though the road had been long and painful, it had also been a journey of growth and healing. Months had passed since that turning point in our lives, and though the journey hadn't been easy, it had been worth every difficult step. Ethan and I had worked hard to rebuild our relationship, finding a new kind of closeness that felt healthier and more balanced. The therapy sessions with Dr. Harper had become a lifeline, a place where we could untangle the emotions and confusion that had threatened to pull us apart. Through it all, I learned to reflect on my own role in the events that unfolded. As a single mother, I had poured all of myself into raising Ethan, making him the center of my world without realizing the unintended consequences of such a dynamic. I had blurred the boundaries between parent and friend, leaving little room for either of us to establish relationships outside of our bubble. It wasn't something I did consciously, but it had shaped the way we saw each other, and it was something I was determined to change. Ethan, too, had come to understand his feelings in a new light. "I guess I was searching for something," he said one evening, his voice thoughtful. "And because you've always been my anchor, it was easy to confuse what I was feeling." We talked openly about the things we'd never spoken of before, the loneliness we both felt, the ways we had leaned on each other, and the boundaries we needed to respect moving forward. Those conversations were painful at times, but they were also healing, helping us to see each other not just as mother and son, but as individuals with our own needs and desires. One of the biggest lessons I took away from this experience was the importance of building a support network. I had spent so many years trying to be everything for Ethan that I had forgotten how much I needed my own outlets, my own friendships and relationships. I started reconnecting with old friends, joining a book club, and even exploring the possibility of dating again. It wasn't easy, but it was liberating to rediscover parts of myself that had been lost over the years. Ethan, too, began to branch out. He focused on his studies and made new friends, building a life that was separate from our shared history. Seeing him thrive brought me a sense of pride and relief. It was a reminder that, despite the challenges we had faced, he was growing into the kind, thoughtful man I always knew he could be. Looking back, I realized that the feelings and confusion we had experienced weren't a reflection of who we were, but of the circumstances we had found ourselves in. It was a stark reminder of how loneliness and emotional dependency can cloud judgment, blurring the lines between love and something else entirely. But it was also a testament to the strength of our bond and our determination to overcome even the most difficult challenges. As I sat on the porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a deep sense of peace. The storm that had once threatened to destroy everything we'd built had passed, leaving behind clear skies and a new perspective. Ethan joined me, sitting down with a soft smile. "You've been quiet today," he said, his tone light but curious. "I was just thinking," I replied, "about how far we've come, about how proud I am of you, and of us." He nodded, his smile growing. "Yeah, it's been a journey, hasn't it?" I reached over and squeezed his hand, a simple gesture that carried none of the confusion or tension it once had. "It has, but we're stronger now because of it." As the sun set, bathing the world in hues of gold and pink, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't thought possible. We had faced something most families never have to confront, and we had come out on the other side stronger, wiser, and more connected than ever. The experience had taught me the value of boundaries, the importance of open communication, and the resilience of love in all its forms. And though the road hadn't been easy, I knew it had shaped us into better versions of ourselves, ready to face whatever the future might hold. If you've ever faced a situation where your emotions felt too complicated to untangle, how did you handle it? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel for more thought-provoking and emotional stories like this one. And stay tuned. Our next story is even more unbelievable. Trust me, you won't want to miss it.